Medieval India, page number 29. Pattern of living. There were no significant changes in the style of dress of men and women during the period. The dhoti and the sari remaining the normal dress for men and women. In addition, in North India, men used the jacket and women the bodais or choli. From sculptures, it appears that long coats, trousers, and shoes were worn by upper class men in North India. According to Rajat Rangini, Harsha introduced into Kashmir a general dress befitting a king. This included the long coat, because we are told that a former chief minister, having worn a short coat, incurred the king's displeasure. Woolen blankets were used in winters, while cotton was material most commonly used. The upper classes also used silk cloth and fine muslin. The Arab travelers testify to the fondness of both men and women for wearing ornaments. Both men and women wore gold bracelets and earrings, sometimes of costly stones. A Chinese writer, Chao Juakua, says that in Gujarat, both men and women have double earrings and wear close fitting clothes with hoods on their heads as well as red colored shoes on their feet. Another famous traveler, Marco Polo, tells us that in Malabar, men and women wore only a loincloth, the king being no exception, and that the profession of the tailor was unknown. Loincloth was also the dress of men and women in Quillion. But though their clothes were scanty, the kings of southern India were fond of jewelry. According to Chaujuakua, the king of Malabar was dressed in cotton loincloth and was barefooted like his subjects. But when going out on an elephant in procession, he wore a golden hat ornamented with pearls and gems, as well as a golden armlets and anklets. Marco Polo says, "What this king wears between gold and gems and pearls is worth more than the city's ransom." As far as food is concerned, while vegetarianism appeared to have been the rule in many areas and sections of population, the leading Smriti writer of the times describes it at great length the occasions on which the eating of meat was lawful. From this, it appears that the peacock, the horse, the wild ass, the wild cock, and the wild pig were regarded as lawful food. Arab writers compliment the Indians about the absence of use of intoxicants among them. However, this appears to be an idealized picture. The literary works of the period, we have many references to wine drinking. Wine was drunk on ceremonial occasions, including marriages and feasts, and outings which were very popular among some classes of citizens. Even women in the king's train indulged freely in wine. While some Smriti writers forbid wine drinking to the three upper castes, some others forbid it only to the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas, being permitted to indulge in it with some exceptions. The literature of the time shows that the people of the towns were fun loving. Apart from fairs, parties, etc., were widely popular. Fights among the various types of animals, such as rams, cocks, etc., as well as wrestling bouts, were popular among the masses. The upper classes continued to be fond of dicing, hunting, and a kind of Indian polo which was regarded as royal pastime. Education, science, and learning. The system of education, which had been gradually developed in earlier period, continued during this period without much change. There was no idea of mass education at that time. People learned what they felt was needed for their livelihood. Reading and writing was confined to a small section, mostly Brahmins, and some sections of the upper classes. Sometimes temples made arrangement for education at a higher level as well. Generally, a student had to go to a house of teacher or to live with him for getting initiation into higher education. In such a case, he had to pay fees to his teacher or give him a gift at the end of his education. Students, particularly those who were too poor to pay fees, were accepted to do personal service to the teacher. The main subjects studied were the various branches of the Vedas and grammar. The responsibility for giving education for a craft or profession was generally left to the guilds or to individual families. For instance, we have a detailed description of a careful manner in which merchant trained his son for his profession. Education of mass of a more formal kind with greater emphasis on secular subjects continued to be provided at some of the Buddhist viharas, monasteries. Nalanda in Bihar was the most famous of these. Other such centers of learning included Vikramshila and Udandpura, which also were in Bihar. All these drew students from distant places including Tibet. Education for most of the residents was free. For meeting their expenses, lavish grants of money and land were given to them by the rulers. Nalanda had a grant of 200 villages. Kashmir was another important center of education. Many Shiva sects and centers of learning flourished in Kashmir during the period. A number of important mutts were set up in South India, such as Madurai and Srinangiri. The various centers of education provided a great impetus to discussions, religion, and philosophy being the main topics. The numerous mutts and other centers of education in various parts of India enabled ideas to flow freely and quickly from one part of the country to another. Philosophical education was not considered complete till the philosopher had visited the various centers of learning in different parts of the country and held discussions with the scholars there. The manner in which ideas could be transmitted throughout the country was important in upholding and strengthening the cultural unity of India. The growth of science in the country slowed down during the period, so that in course of time it was no longer regarded as a leading country in the field of science. Thus, surgery declined because the dissection of dead bodies was regarded as fit only for people of low caste. In fact, surgery became a profession of barbers. Astronomy was gradually pushed into the background by astrology. However, some advance was made in the field of mathematics. The Lilavati of Bhaskar II, which was written during this period, remained a standard text for a long time. Some advance was made in the field of medicine by use of minerals, especially mercury. Many books were written on plant sciences for the treatment of animals, example horses, elephants, etc. But no way was found for breeding fine quality of horses, so that India remained dependent on the import of such horses from Central Asia, including Arabia and Iran. With the conquest of these areas by Muslim rulers, the Indian rulers had to face many difficulties in securing the supply of good horses. There were many reasons for stagnation of Indian science during the period. Experience suggests that the growth of science is closely connected with the growth of society as a whole. As we have seen during the period, society was becoming increasingly rigid and narrow in character. There had been a setback in urban life and communications with growing religious orthodoxy. Another reason was the tendency for the Indians to isolate themselves from the main currents of scientific thought outside India. This reflected in the writings of Al-Biruni, a noted scientist and scholar from Central Asia who lived in India for about 10 years during the early part of 11th century. Although a great admirer of Indian science and learning, Al-Biruni noted the insular attitude of learned people of the country, viz. The Brahmins. He says they are haughty, foolish, vain, self-conceited, stolid. They are by nature niggardly in communicating that which they know, and that and they take the greatest possible care to withhold it from men of another caste among their own people, still much more, of course, from any foreigners. According to their belief, no other created beings beside them have any knowledge of science whatsoever, religious movements, and beliefs. The period marked by a revival of expansion of Hinduism and a continued decline of Buddhism and Jainism. Not only were the tenets of Buddhism and Jainism challenged at the intellectual level, there was on occasion outbreak of violence and forcible occupation of Buddhist and Jain temples. During this period, Buddhism was gradually confined to eastern India. The Pala rulers were patrons of Buddhism. The decline of the Pala power after the 10th century was a blow to Buddhism in the area. But even more serious were the internal developments in Buddhism. Buddha had preached a practical philosophy with a minimum of priesthood and speculation about God. With the rise of the Mahayana school of Buddhism in the early centuries of Christian era, Buddha had begun to be worshipped as a god. This worship now became more elaborate. The belief grew that a worshipper could attain what he desired by uttering magical words, mantra, and making various kinds of mystic gestures. They also believed that by these practices and by various kinds of austerities and secret rites, they could attain supernatural powers such as the power to fly in the air, to become invisible, to see things at a distance, etc. Man has always yearned for control over nature in this manner. It is only with the growth of modern science that many of these yearnings have been fulfilled. Many Hindu yogis also adopted these practices. The most famous among them was Gorakhnath. The followers of Gorakhnath were called Nath Panthis, and at one time they were popular all over North India. Many of these yogis belonged to the lower caste. They denounced the caste system and the path privileges claimed by the Brahmins. The path they preached was called the Tantra, which was open to all, irrespective of caste distinctions. Thus, Buddhism did not so much decline as it assumed forms which made it indistinguishable from Hinduism. Jainism continued to be popular, particularly among the trading communities. The Chalukyan rulers of Gujarat patronized Jainism. It was during this time that some of the most magnificent Jain temples, such as Dilwara Temple at Mount Abu, were built. The Paramara rulers of Malwa also built huge images of Jain saints and of Mahavir, who began the worshipped as god. The magnificent Jainalayas, which were built in various parts, also acted as resting places for travelers. In South India, Jainism attained its high water mark during the 9th and 10th centuries. The Ganga rulers of Karnataka were great patrons of Jainism. During this period, many Jain Basadis, temples, and Mahastambs, pillars, were set up in different parts. The colossal images of Shravana Belgola was set up during this time. The statue is about 18 meters high and was cut out of a granite rock. It shows the saint standing up, practicing rigid austerities, unmindful of the snakes coiled around his feet and the anthills which had grown up. The Jain doctrine of four gifts, learning, food, medicine, and shelter, helped to make Jainism popular among the people. In course of time, the growing rigidity of Jainism and the loss of royal patronage led to the decline of Jainism. The revival and expansion of Hinduism took many forms. Shiva and Vishnu became the chief gods, and magnificent temples were built to proclaim their supremacy. In the process, many local gods and goddesses, including the gods and goddesses of tribals who became Hinduized, became subordinate to their consorts. In eastern India, the consorts Tara, the consort of Buddha, Durga, the consort of Shiva, Kali, etc., became themselves the chief objects of worship. Nevertheless, the rise of the worship of Shiva and Vishnu signified the growth of a process of cultural synthesis. Thus, in an era of disintegration, religion played a positive part, but the religious revival also increased the power and arrogance of the Brahmins. This resulted in a series of popular movements which emphasized the element of human equality and freedom. Thank you everyone for tuning in. In the next part, we'll start with the next paragraph that is related to the Bhakti movement. That is on page number 33 for Medieval India textbook. Thank you everyone for tuning in and keep supporting us. Do like and share and subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and tell us in the comment section below how did you like the video. Thank you everyone for your support and all the best for exams.